Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. Today I wanted to discuss two of my favourite game franchises and specifically their relation to each other. Those franchises are of course Sega's Phantasy Star and Capcom's Monster Hunter, both of which are very dear to me. So what I want to talk about today is how Phantasy Star and Monster Hunter are intrinsically linked, and what this means for players of either franchise who might be interested in checking out the other one. So for the purposes of this video, all the footage that's being shown in the background is from either Phantasy Star Online Blue Burst, PSO2 New Genesis, or Monster Hunter World Iceborne. I have played a few other games, but these are the ones that I've got readily accessible footage for. So first of all, what I want to talk about is how Phantasy Star inspired Monster Hunter. So when I talk about Phantasy Star for this video, I'm specifically referring to the online games. So while the classic series are no doubt important pieces of JRPG history, they don't really correlate as much with what I want to talk about in the video today, so I'm kind of disregarding those for this video. So we're more talking about Phantasy Star Online, to a lesser extent Phantasy Star Universe, but then also Phantasy Star Online 2 and New Genesis. So it's not unusual for game devs to be inspired by other games, and this definitely does hold true for PSO. When PSO was being developed, the dev team were actually told to research and play games that were on the market already, like Diablo, because they wanted to make a multiplayer online looter game. Now, ultimately in the end, not a whole lot from Diablo carried over to PSO's final product. I know that from the interviews that I've read, they decided that they didn't really like the isometric view, so they decided to move away from that, and they also thought that the atmosphere of Diablo was too dark for what they wanted to go for. They wanted to go with obviously a more sci-fi themed game rather than sort of high fantasy, a bit like Diablo. But they used Diablo and a few other games as reference points. So even though not a lot from Diablo did make it over to PSO, you can still see some of the inspiration there in terms of the end game in Diablo. You do spend a lot of time hunting for really rare gear and runes and things like that. Obviously PSO is very rare drop dependent, so there is some crossover there. Now, back in the early 2000s, PSO had obviously released on the Dreamcast, and then later went on to release on PC, then a little bit later GameCube and Xbox, and then a bit later back to PC again with Blue Burst. However, at the same time, Capcom in around 2003-2004 were developing their new PS2 action hunting game, which obviously is Monster Hunter. Now, unfortunately, I have looked for a quote that I've been trying to find, and I can't find this anywhere on the internet anymore. But previously, the Monster Hunter team have actually previously cited Phantasy Star Online as a direct reference. When you break down what Monster Hunter actually is, you can start to see where some of the PSO building blocks actually appear. If you think about it, in PSO, you level up until you get to a point where your level just doesn't really matter that much anymore. Typically, that's when you get into so far very hard in version 1, or into Ultimate in the later games. And then you hunt enemies, basically ad infinitum until you find really rare drops, or not as the case may be. A huge element of PSO's core gameplay loop is defined entirely by that little red box, and I absolutely love it for that. And that is a core mechanic of PSO really. The game is very heavily built around that. If you then translate that over to Monster Hunter, again, a lot of the game is generally spent getting through to the highest ranks. So if we take something like Monster Hunter World Iceborne, for example, a lot of that game involves going through the base game of Monster Hunter World, getting through low rank, getting through high rank, into master rank. The older games, obviously, you go up to G rank, and then hunting monsters for parts. Some of these parts are much rarer than others, so things like gems and mantles are a lot harder to get than other parts. And they'll often require you to hunt or farm that monster until it drops potentially several times. There's also other elements, like there's multiple weapon types that all function completely differently, hub areas where you can idle and chat with your friends. Now, I realise that a lot of these things are present in a lot of games now, but PSO was one of the first games to do this on a console RPG online. Because of that, I do feel that PSO is kind of a pioneer of gaming, no pun intended. And potentially hundreds of games have PSO to thank for being the torchbearer for online console RPGs. I realised that there were online RPGs before PSO, but PSO was the first online console RPG. Now, this is the part in the video where the connection between Phantasy Star and Monster Hunter gets extremely weird. So again, unfortunately, the source for this again seems to have buried itself somewhere in the internet. I have looked and looked for these sources. I could find them until relatively recently, but as soon as I tried getting the information for this video, I cannot find these sources anywhere. But I can assure you that there has been also a discussion from the Phantasy Star Online 2 dev team, where they then cited Monster Hunter as an inspiration for Phantasy Star Online 2. So we're in this weird situation where PSO 1 inspired Monster Hunter, and then Monster Hunter inspired PSO 2. So it's kind of weird that we're going around in circles. Again, if you've played PSO 2, you can probably see some of the Monster Hunter influences in that game. When I say PSO 2 here, I'm primarily talking about PSO 2 Classic, but it does correlate to NGS to an extent as well. So, for example, you have huge bosses with multiple parts, some of which can be broken. You have bosses that rely on you breaking certain bits to change how the fight works. You have PSO 2 also massively expanded on the combat system, especially if you compare it to something like even something like PSU, and especially from the original PSO. PSO 2's combat system is very, very complex and in-depth in comparison to those. It plays very, very different from a slow, more methodical game like Monster Hunter, but it definitely increased the complexity and the skill ceiling for players and encouraged them to learn their class's weapons more thoroughly, which is, again, a lot like Monster Hunter. You'll spend a lot of time in Monster Hunter learning how a weapon works, learning what you can get away with, learning all the different intricacies of that weapon. I should just quickly say, on the subject of it being a much faster game, obviously there are Monster Hunter games that do take that approach, like Monster Hunter Rise, and I think certain elements of Monster Hunter Frontier as well. But generally Monster Hunter is a much more grounded, more methodical game. So if we need even more proof that the two franchises were on good terms, you need only look at the list of collaborations that the Japanese server for PSO2 had back in the day, of which there were a lot. I mean, literally you can think of pretty much almost any anime, almost any game you can think of, there was probably a PSO2 collaboration for it. Guess what was one of the collabs? Yep, Monster Hunter. So it was a collab for Monster Hunter Frontier Z, where we had things like hunter outfits, there were emotes where you could cook meat, and there was even an Elder Dragon, I think it was called something like Eriserion, which was also specific to Frontier. You could fight that in PSO2, and you could even sever its tail and carve its tail. It's clear that the two franchises do have a lot of mutual respect for each other, even if nothing has transpired between them recently. I think this collab in PSO2 may have been the most recent collab between the two, but I could be wrong on that. So just to close this video out, I just want to talk to both sides of both fan bases. So firstly, a little message to the Phantasy Star fans. So why should a Phantasy Star fan consider playing Monster Hunter if they haven't already? So Monster Hunter World was one of the biggest games in recent memory. Certainly one of, if not the biggest Capcom game ever. I don't know if it's been beaten since, but it was huge when it released. From a personal standpoint, I know several people who played PSO years ago. Some of them have moved on through the Phantasy Star franchise, and some of them are still playing things like NGS. However, even more of them moved on to Monster Hunter World. It was surprising how many PSO fans that I knew from back in the day moved directly over to Monster Hunter World, and nearly all of the ones I've spoken to said that they prefer it because they think it feels more like PSO. No one seems to really be able to put a finger on exactly why that is, but there is obviously something inherent with Monster Hunter World in particular that appeals to PSO players. So, having played just a little bit of Monster Hunter World, currently 1,280 hours and counting, I can totally see why Monster Hunter World in particular is so appealing to PSO players. For me, I think there is something incredibly satisfying about struggling through a really difficult fight, whether it's getting slapped into next week by Dark Falls in PSO, or getting melted by Alatron's Eschaton Judgment, in the tiniest of hopes that you might just get that red ring drop or something like a Dragon's Fire. But getting to do all that while you're with a bunch of friends and then chilling in a lobby or gathering hub after, the combination of that addictive action RPG, rare drops, and the social interaction that seems to make a lot of PSO players tick, myself included, and I feel that Monster Hunter World in particular is one of the only games that's really managed to do that. Even if you're a fan of the later games like PSO2 or NGS, I do feel that some elements of those games are also present in games like Monster Hunter. Again, going back to things like the quite complex combat system, less so in NGS, but particularly with PSO2 Classic. And hey, you know, if you do get hooked on Monster Hunter, there is a new one coming in February with Monster Hunter Wild, so it'd be a good time to try it out. So next, just to close this out, let's talk to the Monster Hunter side. So why should a Monster Hunter fan consider playing a Phantasy Star Online game? And again, by this I'm referring to Phantasy Star Online, PSO2 and NGS. So, do you like the idea of farming rare items? You know, you obviously like going for these rare monster parts. But have you ever wished that they're just a bit rarer? A bit impossible to get? Do I have the franchise for you? In all seriousness, no. Phantasy Star Online, in any of its forms, it does capture the balance of like a simple gameplay loop. It has either simple or complex gameplay depending on which version you play. You know, if you want a very simple game, PSO doesn't get much more simple. Or you can go complex with something like PSO2 Classic, or somewhere in the middle, which would be something like NGS. There's also a ton of rare items to go after. So if you are one of these people who goes after trying to find the rarest items in Monster Hunter, PSO is a fantastic game for that. It's kind of what the franchise existed around, particularly for the early games. It has moved away from that somewhat, but particularly in the early games like PSO, that is almost the entire purpose of the endgame. Alternatively, if you want to try PSO, there are still private servers available, so for anyone who might not be familiar with PSO, if you want to try the older games like Phantasy Star Online or Phantasy Star Universe, there are still private servers available out there for them. It's very easy to find them, and they're very, very easy to get set up. They do still have active fan bases as well, so don't feel like you're playing them on your own, because particularly for PSO, there is a very active fan base still. Alternatively, if you do want to try the later games, you can try things like PSO2 NGS, which is available currently on loads of different platforms, and that comes with a DLC for PSO2 Classic as well. PSO2 NGS is also free, so even if you don't like it, you're not losing anything. And you do get PSO2 as a free DLC for that as well, so if you want to play PSO2 Classic, that's free as well. There are transactions in the game, but you can play it totally fine for free, honestly. While NGS isn't the best game in the franchise, it has improved recently, and as I've said, it is free, and you do get that PSO2 Classic bundled in as well as a free DLC. So hopefully this video, basically the reason for this is I want to try and encourage Phantasy Star fans to maybe consider trying a Monster Hunter game. But I also want to do it the other way as well, so I'd like to see Monster Hunter fans maybe try a Phantasy Star Online game as well. I do feel like there is that inherent crossover between the two, and although each franchise do exist on their own merits, I do think they all both owe each other something as well. That Monster Hunter literally owes online RPG gaming potentially to Phantasy Star, particularly for the console side. And I think that Phantasy Star has obviously been very heavily inspired by the rapid growth of Monster Hunter as well. It's no doubt that Monster Hunter is a much bigger franchise now. It is huge now, whereas I feel that Phantasy Star is kind of still quite niche overall. But I do feel like Phantasy Star is definitely picking up on things from Monster Hunter and trying to sort of implement them in its own way. So thanks for listening to me ramble on about this. I am, as you can probably tell, I'm a huge fan of both Phantasy Star and of Monster Hunter as well. This channel is primarily Phantasy Star related, but I am planning to do some more Monster Hunter content as well, so it will kind of split between the two. So if you're a fan of either franchise, please consider the usual, either liking, subscribing, or join as a member if you want to. You can also follow me over on Twitch and Twitter if you want to as well. I do tend to stream twice a week usually. So yeah, thanks for listening to me absolutely just ramble about these two games and how much I love them. And I'll see you in whichever franchise you decide to play. See you guys later.